everyone. I'm Kate Showalter, and today I'll be discussing management of change in Maximo. About me, I'm a senior Maximo consultant at OnTrax. I've been here for about 3 years. I've particularly focused on MOCs, having done 5 or 6 MOC projects since I've started here. I definitely have a bit of experience in the area. What we'll be going over today, I'll be introducing management of change, so what it is and what an MOC procedure should involve. Then I'll be going over why management of change is necessary in industry. I'll also be doing a demo of Maximo's management of change applications. I'll be running essentially through a typical end-to-end process. And then at the end, I'll go over some common configurations that clients have chosen to do, and then open the floor for questions. So, what is management of change? Management of change is a structured approach to transitioning from a current state to a future state. So what management of change involves is evaluating, authorizing, and documenting changes before they're made, and you want to ensure that those changes don't affect the system's integrity. So a change doesn't just have to be to an equipment or a piece of equipment. It can be to a process, it can be to personnel, it can be to facilities, operations, it can even document changes to documentation and management of change. Management of change also ensures that risks are tracked and managed when a change is made, and any mitigation that might need to be done is handled. So a typical MOC procedure should include a number of things. It should include key MOC steps, so that would essentially be your process from beginning to end. It should include a definition of what a change is and what a replacement in kind is. So a replacement in kind would essentially be replacing something, whether that's equipment or a procedure or something like that, with something that is very similar. So if you're replacing a part by another manufacturer that has identical specs, that would likely be a replacement in kind. Whereas if you actually have to do some level of analysis on the new part that's being installed due to changing specifications, that would be a management of change. Your procedure should also include technical information, any impact that the change might have, including a risk assessment and a HAZOP. Management of changes should include correct authorization for that change through some sort of review process, change approval board, authorization process, anything along those lines. Management of change should also include assigning personnel, and that can be to either approval or to various tasks involved with the MOC. An MOC should also include a process for tracking action items. It should also include, towards the end of it, training of any personnel that might be impacted by the change, and any safety information and documentation should be updated per the change. So some examples of changes would be a change from original design specifications and some equipment, a change to a process, changing operating conditions so that they're outside of the approved operating range. It might be changes to a material or specifications. It might be a change to the way that critical activities are done, changing personnel, or changing your organizational or reporting structure. So there's definitely a lot of scope for it outside of the traditional fields of changing equipment. So why do people need management for change? Management of change is actually legally required in many industries or for certain assets. So, for example, in Alberta, there are regulations requiring that change management processes are used for any changes to pressure vessels, and that's dictated by ABSA rules. There are various rules and regulations dictating that change management is required for various industries. It's also beneficial because it improves system integrity by making sure that everything is properly tracked and managed. A nice advantage of management of change in Maximo as opposed to another solution is that Maximo integrates work management along with change management. So what that does is allows you to track what work is being done for the management of change record. It allows you to do any sort of cost tracking that might be involved. It allows you to ultimately create a management of change record from a service request or an MOC request, as I'm going to be demoing. Another advantage of management of change is that you can do bad actor review. So you can keep track of previous deferrals or failures at an MOC's location in Maximo, and that will give you an idea of, are things creating recurring issues? Has the same solution been applied before, and if so, did it fix the problem? And whether there are any recurring failures that we might be able to address. And then a nice bonus with Maximo is that you can maintain, by using an electronic MOC process, a consistent process for change management, and then that'll let you integrate it with work management. Maximo's management of change process typically follows this line. So you start with a change request, and then you do a risk assessment and a cost assessment of what this change involves. It would go through a review and approval process, which it would be up to your process to decide who might be the appropriate people to review this change and approve it. Typically, a lot of companies have what's called a change approval board, where they just have a bunch of people get together once a week to discuss any changes and whether they're approved or not. Maximo's process also involves pre-start actions, which are essentially actions taken before the MOC process can begin. It also has an authorization to start, which is essentially verification that pre-start actions have been completed sufficiently, documentation has been updated. That is, once again, decided upon by one or a body of people. Post-start actions are any actions that might need to be taken after the MOC process has started. And closure is essentially updating documentation, making sure that everything is in order, doing training, handing it off to the end user. So the standard MOC process in Maximo can be configured to whatever your needs are. There have definitely been a lot of differences depending on what various clients are looking for. And the inclusion or exclusion of certain phases of the process can be controlled by workflow. So I'm going to do a demo here to show off what Maximo's management of change applications look like. So in Maximo, there are two management of change applications that you're going to be concerned with. They're both included in Maximo for oil and gas. One is called Moc Requests, which you can essentially think of as a mirror of a service request. And the other one is Moc Oil, which involves a lot of the more in-depth process involved with MOCs, so assignment of actions, review and approval, that kind of thing. So we'll start with Moc Requests, and we're going to create a new one. So in Maximo's Moc Request application, it's essentially a mirror of what you're going to see in the first tab of the MOC application when we get later onto that. So a user would come in here and enter in a change that they were interested in making. So we're going to do, someone wants to replace a Fisher control valve with a Kimray leaf valve. You'll notice that the person who requested it, their name is filled in as a requested by for tracking and auditing purposes. Typically, what we do with MOC requests, and this is a common client configuration, is they would select someone who would review it before it's turned into an actual MOC. So we're going to enter a person there. You'll notice that the MOC request can be related to a lot of different things, not just locations and assets, but also items, PMs, and job plans. The reason for this is that, especially with PMs and job plans, you might be changing the way that maintenance is done, how often it's done, whether you change your process for maintenance, in which case you'd be changing a job plan. In this case, because we're changing an actual piece of equipment, we're going to select a location. Unfortunately, there aren't too many oil and gas-related options, so we'll go with mold manufacturer. So we've entered our location that's affected by this management of change. If you use a proprietary project ID or MOC ID within your system, you can choose to enter it here. We're going to select our MOC type as a MOC because this is a change. And we're going to categorize it as a plant change. Replace Fisher control valve with Kimray relief valve. And our justification is going to be that the Fisher control valve is failing to meet our needs. And in the dates section, we can specify when we expect to start and finish it, when we require it by, any dates that might be related to scheduling. So we're going to aim to start it towards the end of the month and finish it at the end of the month. In the MOC request record, you also have the option of associating related records. So within this, you can associate work orders if there's any sort of investigation that needs to be done on the feasibility of this MOC request. And you can also associate it with tickets if this originated with an SR. From within either of those apps, it is possible to generate MOC requests, so it isn't necessarily mandatory that you select them within here. If you generate them, an MOC request from a work order or from a ticket, it'll automatically show up. As well, we have a work log, which is pretty typical for any of the work management type applications. Here we can enter any reasons that we might be approving the MOC, requesting more information, a reason that we might be rejecting it, any information that might be relevant to track and audit as far as this record goes. So we'll say that the CAP approves the MOC request, and we can save it and approve it. So typically this process would be done by a workflow, but in this case, because it's a demo machine, I'm essentially changing the status. A typical workflow for an MOC request would look like someone issues the request, specifies a reviewer, they either cancel it or request more information or turn it into an MOC. So we're going to turn this request into an MOC at this stage. And that's available under Create MOC. If any sort of work needed to be done for this request, you could create a work order from here. Or any sort of investigation, you could create an investigation record. So you'll note that the newly created MOC is now available under Related Work Orders, and we can navigate to it. You'll see that within this created MOC, all of our data that we've entered in the request has been carried over with the exception of dates. Commonly, clients request to carry those over. Well, that's a fairly simple configuration to make. For the time being, we'll just re-enter those. So typically at this point in the process, you'd be deciding what level of risk is associated with this MOC, as well as any costing that might be involved. So all of that is going to be managed in the Projects and Risks tab. I've created a risk assessment in advance for this demo. But essentially, you would either use Maximo's out-of-box risk assessment, or I've commonly seen that clients have their own internal method of doing risk assessment and just adapt the MOC application to use that. You can also specify projects and costing in this tab. So we're going to say that this MOC is going to cost $3,000. And that's generally an important part of being able to obtain approval for an MOC, is understanding the risk and understanding the cost of it. So the next stages of an MOC process are often reviewing and approving it. So typically, clients do review through a change advisory board, or they have a set group of people that they have determined are going to review MOCs and approve MOCs. So we're going to say that Wilson will review this MOC, as well as Santana. And we're also going to select 2 people for approval. So if this is a workflow process, typically this would be around the point where they push the MOC forward for approval by routing the workflow. But in this case, we'll pretend that I am all of these people, and I'm going to review and approve it. So the next stage of the MOC process in Maximo is typically pre-start actions. Some clients choose to have set pre-start actions that are common depending on what MOC type you're using or what type of change you're making. Some just have a big list and ultimately leave it up to the lead engineer to decide which actions to perform or not perform. So in this case, I've generated a couple of MOC actions. We've got risk analysis, health and safety, hazard analysis, and redlining drawings. So you'll also notice that out of box, it doesn't allow you to add pre-start actions to approved MOCs, but that is entirely customizable. So we'll leave it in waiting for approval so we don't run into that error again. So you can select these actions. If there's a working group that might be associated with a given action, you can specify this by selecting person groups under action by group. If there's an individual that might typically be responsible, that would be specified under action by. So for the sake of simplicity, we're going to have Wilson perform all of these tasks. And then typically in this segment of the process, it would be pushed forward to Wilson by workflow, and he would come in and he would complete all of these. So once pre-start has been completed, generally that is when authorization to start comes in. So authorization to start looks very similar to what review and approval did. Typically, this is just going to be one or two people, do a sanity check on the pre-start actions, on any documentation that you might have attached to the MOC, and they say, yep, this looks good, we're going to sign off on it. So they would go through, they would check the pre-start actions, and if there were attachments, they would check them here, make sure they look good, and they would give their authorization for the MOC to continue. So we're going to say that Fred Stanley is authorizing this MOC to start. He can put in comments. And at this point, it would be authorized. He would route it forward. So it's worth noting at this point that similar to MOC requests, you can associate work orders. So this is important because this is where costing would be involved. So if there was work being done for pre-start, post-start actions for the MOC itself, you would create work orders within here. And using your typical work management process, you could track any costs associated with the MOC, as well as any labor that might be involved, materials needing to be ordered. So after it's been authorized to start and the change has actually been completed, post-start actions are performed, which are very similar to pre-start actions. They're just done after the MOC has taken place, or after the change has taken place. So we're going to select some common post-start actions, including training personnel, attaching as-built documents, and completing PHAs. And similar to pre-start actions, you can choose who it's going to be assigned to. And the workflow process would typically assign this to each of these individuals to complete. So once post-start actions have been completed, the typical next step of the process is for someone to do a closure review. Often this is just the lead engineer who's kind of spearheading the MOC. So we'll go to the closure tab. Typically in a workflow process, this would be assigned to a given person. It would take them over there and they can fill out any details they need to do. So there are some out-of-box options for closure details, but it's very typical to add additional ones if needed. So you can specify whether an after-action review needs to take place, whether lessons learned need to be documented. Generally, it's a common workflow requirement that documentation attached is checked just as a final sanity check to make sure that people do attach their documentation. And it's very typical to require closure comments before closing an MOC. And then the person who reviews it can put their name in. So we'll say that Tom reviewed it this time. And at this stage in a typical MOC process, it would be closed. Some other interesting features before I move on within the MOC application. You can view MOC history in here. Sorry. Okay, so because there are no previous MOCs, we aren't showing history, but you can see here that if there were any previous deferrals or failures at this location, they would be documented here. So this is very useful for bad actor review in that if there was a recurring issue at a given location or for a given asset, you could track it within here and see that something was up. So that's the basic MOC process. I'm going to go over some common configurations that clients request. So the first one that I've kind of hinted at throughout this process is that nearly everyone uses a workflow process. So as I mentioned earlier in an introduction to management of change, a typical MOC procedure, you do need to define key steps at a standardized process. So Maximo has the advantage of being able to standardize the entire process, moving through each of the tabs, assigning work to given people. All of that can be automated as a workflow. So typically, we would outline a structure, say that the MOC is requested, it's passed on to an MOC, review and approval processes happen, all of those kind of things. Any checks and balances that might be a necessary part of your process, that all goes into workflow. And yeah, the main reason that you do that is you want to keep it consistent. You don't want to have one MOC be a radically different process from any other MOC. A lot of clients also request start centers, which, if you're unfamiliar with Maximo start centers, are the screen that you see when you first log in. Typically, they request result sets to be added. So we can have useful result sets like which MOCs are open, which temporary MOCs are about to expire, and we can also create key performance indicators that might show the number of MOCs that are open, the number of temporary MOCs, the number of expired MOCs, how many MOCs are in deferral. Other common changes within the app itself. Typically, it's requested that additional fields are added. The scope and justification boxes are made larger because they don't actually hold a ton of information. Attachments get carried over from the requests to the MOCs. A very important one for auditing that a lot of people request is you'll notice that I was able to review my own MOC and check off all of my own approval boxes and complete my own pre-start actions. Typically, we enforce a much better audit process where only the person who's been assigned to review or only the person who's been assigned a pre-start action is able to actually complete it. Also, quite often, auditing is performed where an additional field lists which person checked each given box, just in case some people allow MOCs to be approved by other people, but then that just keeps an audit trail to say, okay, this was assigned to this person, but someone else actually approved it. Another very typical one is that the entire MOC is locked down after it's approved. The reason for this is that you don't want anyone to go back in and change what the process was after it's obtained approval, or change costing, change the risk. Obviously, that can introduce a lot of concerns with integrity. So commonly we just lock everything down the moment it's been approved. I mentioned briefly in closure additional details and often verification that what they say is true. So we might include a workflow process that says if this documentation attached checkbox is checked, there actually has to be documentation attached, or else the record will fail to move forward. Another very common one is within the View Workflow Assignments window, we allow MOC engineers to have a button that allows them to reassign the MOC process to someone else, just in case there's a process that has to move forward faster or an emergency process that needs to be reassigned and someone is currently on vacation and can't do it. As well, typically reports might be created for the MOC. So a lot of people are going from a paper-based system to an electronic system, and they want to maintain that printout of what their MOC entailed, especially if you're in a jurisdiction that involves sealing as far as engineers go. It's very beneficial to have a physical copy that you can seal to approve that everything has been completed in a manner that makes sense. This concludes today's webcast. I want to thank everyone who attended today. I trust that everyone found the webcast of interest and value to your organization. If anyone wants a copy of the presented PowerPoint, feel free to send me an email. And if there are any questions that were missed or you think of afterwards, feel free to grab my email address or my phone number here and just drop me a line and I can answer them for you. So again, thanks everyone for your time and interest, and we look forward to meeting you again during our next webcast.